Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The boy arrived in San Francisco when the city still tasted of salt and sawdust, when buildings rose faster than anyone could name the streets. He came with his uncle on a ship that had already claimed his parents to fever, somewhere in the Middle Passage. 7 years old, speaking no English, clutching a wooden box that held his mother's comb and his father's broken watch. Uncle Wei found work immediately. The city devoured laborers then, men to dig, to build, to haul. He told the boy to stay invisible, to keep his head down, to remember that survival meant becoming a shadow. But shadows need something to cling to, and the boy found his anchor in light. Mr. Hartwell's photography studio sat wedged between a tailor shop and a boarding house on a street that smelled of fish and horse manure. The old man needed someone small enough to crawl under the camera's black cloth, quick enough to prepare the glass plates before the collodion dried. He paid almost nothing. Uncle Wei approved because it kept the boy off the docks, away from the worst dangers. The studio became a different world. Chemicals lined the shelves in brown bottles with handwritten labels: silver nitrate, potassium iodide, acetic acid. The boy learned their names before he learned most English words. He discovered that light could be trapped, that moments could be stolen from time and fixed onto glass. Mr. Hartwell's hands shook from age, but his voice stayed steady when he explained how exposure worked, how the invisible image slept in the emulsion until developer woke it. Clients came and went, miners wanting to send proof of their prosperity back east, merchants' wives in their best dresses, sometimes Chinese families, though they often whispered about cameras stealing souls. The boy watched Mr. Hartwell arrange them, adjusting light and shadow until the person before the lens became somehow more true than the flesh version. He began to understand that photographs told lies and truth simultaneously. Uncle Wei came home later each year, left earlier each morning. His hands grew harder, his cough deepened. He brought money and said nothing about where the work took him. The boy knew not to ask. In Chinatown, everyone understood that questions could be dangerous, that curiosity was a luxury for those with citizenship papers and pale skin. The Irish girl appeared when the boy had been at the studio 3 years. She delivered laundry for her mother, always Thursday mornings. Mary, she said her name was. She talked constantly, asked questions Mr. Hartwell never answered, and laughed at things that were not funny. The boy stayed silent, but she spoke to him anyway, as if his silence was a kind of conversation. "Do you like it?" she asked once, gesturing at the camera. catching people like that?" He nodded. "My ma says it's unnatural, says God didn't mean for us to freeze time." He had no answer for that. But he thought perhaps freezing time was exactly what people needed when everything moved too fast, when the city changed overnight, and nothing felt permanent. Mr. Hartwell taught him to see light as a thing with weight and texture. Morning light was thin and honest. Afternoon light was thick and forgiving. The light just before fog rolled in held a strange quality, as if the air itself was uncertain whether to be solid or transparent. The boy learned to read it, to know how many seconds an exposure would need before the subject moved and ruined everything. He also learned to read people, the ones who held their breath and stiffened, the ones who tried to smile and looked like they were in pain, the ones who forgot about the camera and became, briefly, themselves. Those were the best photographs, though clients rarely wanted them. Uncle Wei died when the boy was 15, an accident at a construction site. That was all anyone would say. There was no body to photograph, no proof it had happened except the silence where his uncle's coughing used to be. The boy inherited $43 in coins and bills, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden under a floorboard. It felt like both a fortune and an insult. Mr. Hartwell said he could stay, could keep working. The old man was kind in his way, though kindness always came with boundaries. The boy slept in the studio's back room, ate rice and vegetables he cooked on a small stove, saved every coin that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival. He thought about opening his own studio someday, about being someone who chose his subjects instead of just preparing plates for another man's vision. The city kept growing. The Transcontinental Railroad's completion brought more people, more noise, more tension. The boy heard stories about camps where workers died, about promises broken, about men who vanished and were never counted. He heard these stories in Chinatown, whispered over tea, never spoken loud enough for the wrong ears. He was 17 when Mr. Hartwell's heart stopped one Tuesday afternoon. The old man was adjusting a lens, complaining about his eyesight, and then he was simply gone. The boy stood there for several minutes, unsure whether to touch him, whether touching would make it more real. The landlord came. Mr. Hartwell's nephew came from Sacramento. There were discussions about the studio, about equipment, about what belonged to whom. The boy stayed quiet, made himself useful, prepared the funeral photograph because someone had to, and he knew how the old man would have wanted it done. The nephew sold most of the equipment, but he let the boy purchase the older camera, some plates, chemicals, and the developing trays at a price that was almost fair. Perhaps he felt generous. Perhaps he simply wanted the studio emptied quickly. The boy, no longer quite a boy, took his $43 and his inheritance and his knowledge, and he began to plan. He knew the wet collodion process forward and backward. He knew how to make portraits that satisfied customers. He understood that in San Francisco, even a Chinese photographer could find work if his images were sharp enough, if he charged less than his competitors, if he made himself indispensable through skill. He rented a tiny space, barely larger than a closet, in a building that leaned slightly to one side. He painted a sign himself, letters careful and clear. He bought rice in bulk and learned to ignore hunger on slow days. He visited Mary's mother's laundry and asked if she needed photographs of her business for advertising. She said no, but mentioned him to others. The first paying client was a nervous young man who wanted a portrait to send to a girl back in Boston. The photograph turned out well, honest, flattering, without being false. The man returned with friends. Word spread slowly, the way trust always spreads among people who have learned to be suspicious. At night, developing plates in the red glow of the safety lamp, he sometimes thought about his uncle, about Mr. Hartwell, about all the moments that disappeared because no one had been there to capture them. Photography felt like an argument with time, a small rebellion against forgetting. The chemicals stung his hands. The silver nitrate stained his fingers. The fumes made his eyes water. But when an image emerged from the developer, when the invisible became visible, when light and shadow arranged themselves into truth, those moments made the rest bearable. He was 18 years old, alone in a city that barely acknowledged his existence, practicing a craft that turned light into memory. He did not yet know that some memories would refuse to stay buried, that some images would reveal more than they should, that his careful, invisible life was about to become impossible to sustain. But for now, he had his studio, his skills, and his determination. That would have to be enough. Success came in copper coins and small victories. A merchant needed photographs of his inventory for insurance purposes. A family wanted their daughter's portrait before she married. A newspaper editor, desperate and deadline-pressed, hired him to photograph a collapsed building because their regular man was drunk. The images were sharp, properly exposed, delivered on time. The editor remembered. The studio remained modest but stable. Rent came easier now, though never easily. He learned to negotiate without seeming to negotiate, to quote prices that were low enough to attract customers, but high enough to suggest competence. The balance was delicate. Too cheap, and people assumed poor quality. Too expensive, and they went to photographers whose skin matched their own. Mary appeared one afternoon carrying a dress over her arm, calling his name through the door before she opened it. She had become a seamstress, worked for a woman on Powell Street who made gowns for bankers' wives. Her hands were perpetually pricked with needle marks, her eyes tired from fine stitching in poor light. "I need a favor," she said, then laughed at herself. "Actually, I need a trade. Photographs of my work in exchange for mending your shirts, which are frankly an embarrassment." He agreed because the shirts were indeed an embarrassment, and because Mary's company reminded him that not everyone in the city saw him as either invisible or threatening. She talked while he arranged the dress on a form, adjusting the drape, positioning his single good lamp to make the fabric shimmer. "Do you ever photograph people who've died?" she asked suddenly. He nodded. Post-mortem photography was common, especially for children. Parents wanted something to remember, some proof their child had existed. "Seems strange," she said, "but I suppose it's kinder than nothing." He thought about this while exposing the plate. Kindness took strange forms. Sometimes kindness was simply bearing witness. The newspaper work increased. Editors discovered that photographs sold papers better than illustrations. Readers wanted to see the city's growth, its disasters, its transformations, captured with mechanical honesty. He photographed new buildings, ship arrivals, parade crowds. The work paid irregularly, but added legitimacy. People began referring to him by name instead of as the Chinese photographer on the second floor. The first crime scene came on a Thursday morning in late spring. A police officer appeared at his door, badge visible, expression professionally neutral. "Detective Murphy," he introduced himself. There had been an incident at the docks. The department needed documentation. Their usual photographer was unavailable. Someone had mentioned his name. The body lay between two warehouses in a space too narrow for proper light. A man, face down, blood pooled beneath him in a shape that looked almost artistic against the wooden planks. Detective Murphy stood back, smoking a cigarette, watching him work with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. He set up his camera carefully, trying not to think about the fact that he was photographing someone's end. The technical challenges occupied his mind instead. Insufficient light, awkward angle, the need to capture details that might prove important later, the position of the hands, the tears in the clothing, the scattered coins near the body's feet. "Can you get a clear image in this?" Murphy asked. He nodded, adjusting his exposure time, using every trick Mr. Hartwell had taught him about coaxing detail from shadows. The developed plates showed everything. Too much, perhaps. The violence was rendered with absolute clarity. Murphy seemed satisfied, paid him promptly, and told him the department would call again if needed. They called again, and again. Death, it turned out, was steady work. He photographed accident scenes, fire damage, evidence for trials. Each scene taught him something about the city's hidden architecture, the way violence concentrated in certain areas, the way poverty and death tangled together, the way some bodies received careful investigation while others were processed with bureaucratic indifference. Chinese and Irish victims tended to receive less attention than others. This pattern was never stated officially, but was obvious to anyone paying attention. The work bothered him in ways he could not articulate. At night, developing these plates, the images seemed to accuse him of something, profiting from tragedy, turning suffering into commerce. But someone had to document these things. Someone had to create evidence that might lead to justice, however imperfect. He bought a better lens with his accumulated savings, then immediately regretted the extravagance. But the lens produced sharper images, and sharp images led to more work. The investment justified itself within months. His 24th year brought unexpected prosperity. Not wealth, he still ate cheaply, still wore mended clothes, but a feeling of security he had never previously experienced. His studio was known, his skills were recognized, he had regular clients and semi-regular income. He sent money to distant cousins in China, people he barely remembered, but who represented connection to something before San Francisco. Mary's brother joined the police force, which created an odd tension. Patrick was friendly enough, but his friendliness had boundaries that Mary's did not. He made jokes about photographers and artists, about men who work with their hands but did not really labor. The jokes were meant to be harmless, but revealed assumptions about hierarchy, about what counted as real work. The city continued its relentless expansion. Cable cars appeared, climbing hills that had seemed impassable. Telegraph lines multiplied, gas lamps pushed back darkness. He photographed much of this progress, creating a visual record of transformation that felt important even when no one specifically requested it. These images were for himself, for some future moment when he might want to remember how the city had looked before it became whatever it was becoming. He met others in his profession occasionally. A few were welcoming, most were territorial. One elderly photographer, German accent thick as fog, told him bluntly that he should focus on Chinese clients, that white customers would never fully trust him, that trying to compete directly was foolish. The man meant well, probably. The advice contained truth mixed with prejudice, in proportions difficult to separate. But clients kept coming. Quality outweighed discomfort for enough people to sustain his business. He learned to read hesitation in potential customers, to address concerns before they were voiced, to be professional to the point of invisibility. The work itself became his argument. Detective Murphy became something approaching regular contact. Not friendship, the social distance was too great for that, but professional respect. Murphy treated him as a craftsman whose skills served the law. This was more than many offered. The detective's cases grew more complex, more serious. Murder investigations now, not just accidents. The photographs became evidence in trials, scrutinized by lawyers and juries. He attended court once, called to verify his image's authenticity. The experience was unsettling. His photographs projected large, displayed to strangers who studied them for details he had not consciously noticed. A defense attorney questioned his methods, suggested the images were manipulated. He explained the wet collodion process, the chemical impossibility of the alterations being suggested. The attorney backed down, but the implication lingered, that his truth might be doubted, that mechanical accuracy was not enough to overcome suspicion. The trial ended with conviction. Justice, apparently. But he wondered about the photograph's role, about whether images could capture enough truth to justify the weight placed upon them. Years accumulated like silver deposits on glass plates. Slowly, through repeated exposure, building towards something permanent. His 26th year resembled his 23rd, which resembled his 21st. This stability felt like success. He had survived. He had built something modest but real. His hands were stained with chemicals, his savings growing steadily, his reputation solid within careful limits. Mary married a carpenter, moved to a larger apartment, stopped visiting the studio as frequently. This felt like a natural progression, rather than abandonment. People's lives diverged. He attended the wedding, took formal portraits of the couple, charged them nothing, and accepted their gratitude. He remained alone. Not from lack of opportunity, but from caution learned early and reinforced constantly. Relationships created vulnerabilities. Attachments gave others leverage. The city had taught him that visibility could be dangerous, that the safest path was the one that attracted least attention. But loneliness accumulated too, its own kind of deposit. Some evenings, finishing work late, walking home through streets lamp-lit and foggy, he felt the weight of his isolation as something almost physical. He had colleagues, but no confidants. Clients, but no community. Respect, but no intimacy. He turned 28, having accomplished what his 17-year-old self would have considered impossible. He had his own business, financial security, professional recognition. The boy who arrived with nothing had become a man with something. Yet some nights, in the dark room's red glow, waiting for images to emerge from chemical baths, he felt like he was still waiting for his real life to begin. As if everything so far had been preparation for something larger, some purpose not yet revealed. The feeling was probably foolish. Most lives were exactly what they appeared to be: work, survival, small pleasures, eventual decline. Expecting more was the privilege of people born with advantages he would never possess. Still, The feeling persisted, a sense of incompletion, a suspicion that the photographs he had taken so far were merely practice for images yet to come, images that would reveal something he was not yet prepared to see. The murder happened in an alley off Pacific Street, where the fog came thick and stayed late into morning. Detective Murphy's message arrived just after dawn, brief, professional, containing an address and the words, "Bring extra plates." By the time he reached the scene, the body had been there long enough for the blood to stop looking wet. A man, middle-aged, Chinese, lying face up with his eyes still open. The wounds suggested a knife, multiple strikes. No wallet, no identification. Two uniformed officers stood nearby looking bored. Murphy crouched beside the body, notebook in hand, making sketches that would never capture what photographs could. He set up his equipment with practiced efficiency. The alley was narrow, the light poor. He positioned his camera to capture the body's position, the surrounding debris, the scuff marks in the dirt that might indicate struggle. 3 exposures from different angles. Standard procedure by now. Murphy watched him work with the attention of someone genuinely interested in craft. "You ever get used to this?" the detective asked. He shook his head slightly, not looking up from his focusing cloth. "Good. The day you get used to it is the day you should quit." The plates went into his carrying case, carefully wrapped. He would develop them that afternoon, deliver the prints to the police station by evening. The routine had become automatic. Back in his studio, he prepared the developing bath, slid the first plate into the solution, and watched the image emerge. The body, the alley, the details rendered with mechanical precision. He moved to the second plate, repeated the process. Similar view, different angle. The third plate stopped him. In the background, barely visible in the alley's deep shadow, stood a figure. A man in dark clothing, worker's cap, turned slightly away from the camera. The image was blurred, movement during the long exposure perhaps, but definitely there. He leaned closer to the plate, squinting in the dark room's red light. Had someone been there? He had not noticed anyone. The uniformed officers would have mentioned a witness, probably a passerby who wandered into frame during the exposure. The long exposure times required for low light meant any movement created ghosting. Technical flaw, not evidence. He made prints from all 3 plates, including the anomalous one. Murphy should decide what was relevant. The detective studied the third print for a long time, lips pursed. "You see anyone else there?" "No. Possible someone passed through during exposure." Murphy folded the print carefully, placed it with the others. "Possible," he agreed, but his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied. 3 weeks later, another murder. Irish dock worker found behind a warehouse near the waterfront. Murphy called him again. Different location, different victim, same grim routine. He photographed the scene methodically, noting positions, distances, conditions. 4 plates this time. Murphy wanted thorough documentation. Developing them that evening, he almost missed it. The 4th plate, taken from the warehouse's far corner to show the body's position relative to the street. And there, in the frame's edge, the same blurred figure. Same dark clothing, same worker's cap, same sense of deliberate positioning just inside the composition. His hands went still in the chemical bath. This was not chance, not technical error. He examined the plate more closely. The figure stood near a stack of crates, partially obscured but clearly present. The blur suggested movement, but the positioning felt intentional, as if the person knew exactly where the camera's field of view ended. He made the print, stared at it for a long time before adding it to Murphy's set. Should he mention the similarity? Point out the pattern? But what pattern? Two blurred figures in two photographs?
Coincidence was more plausible than conspiracy.
Murphy said nothing when he delivered the prints. Perhaps the detective had not noticed, or had noticed and dismissed it as irrelevant. Witnesses sometimes appeared in crime scene photographs. People were curious, drawn to tragedy like moths to flame. But witnesses identified themselves. They gave statements. They did not appear as blurred shadows and then vanish. He began reviewing his older plates, the archive of crime scenes from the past years. Most showed nothing unusual, just bodies, blood, evidence, the grim documentation of violence. But 3 images, spread across 8 months, contained similar figures, always at the frame's edge, always blurred, always in clothing that suggested manual labor. The same person? Impossible to confirm from such poor images, but the repetition felt deliberate. Someone was appearing in these photographs intentionally, timing their presence to coincide with his exposures. The technical knowledge required for this was considerable. You would need to understand photography, to know exposure times, to position yourself precisely. And you would need to know when and where crime scenes would be photographed. Information available only to police and those they hired. He said nothing to Murphy. The explanation sounded absurd even in his own mind. Someone haunting crime scenes, appearing in photographs as blurred warnings or messages? The city's spiritualist photographers made fortunes from such claims, producing spirit photographs through obvious double exposures and darkroom tricks. He had no interest in joining their fraudulent ranks. But he could not stop thinking about it. At night, unable to sleep, he tried to construct logical explanations. A vagrant who frequented these areas, a curious witness too nervous to approach police, a photographer's apprentice studying crime scene documentation. None of these explanations survived scrutiny. The precision was too exact, the repetition too consistent. He met Dr. Sarah Winters through Murphy at a coroner's inquest where he was called to present his photographs. She was the coroner's assistant, one of perhaps 3 women in San Francisco holding such a position. Tall, severe expression, eyes that missed nothing. She studied his images with the same clinical attention she likely gave corpses. "Your photographs are remarkably clear," she commented afterward. "Better than most medical illustrations." He thanked her, unsure what else to say. "Do you ever notice details later that you missed during exposure?" The question startled him with its perceptiveness. "Sometimes. The camera sees differently than the eye." "Yes, more honestly perhaps, or more completely." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "Our observations are limited by expectation. We see what we anticipate seeing. Mechanical processes have no such bias." The conversation stayed with him, more completely. Was that what the blurred figures represented? Something the camera saw that his conscious attention had missed? But that did not explain the repetition, the deliberate positioning. Another murder. This time a young Chinese woman found in an alley near Chinatown. Strangled, not stabbed. Murphy was particularly grim about this one, the violence against a woman adding different weight to the investigation. He photographed carefully, aware that these images might appear in court, might be scrutinized by jury members unaccustomed to such brutal documentation. 5 plates. He developed them in sequence, trying to maintain clinical detachment. The first 4 showed what they should: evidence, positioning, context. The 5th plate showed the figure again, this time closer, more distinct. Still blurred from movement, but clear enough to see. A man, Chinese, workers' clothing, standing beside a pile of refuse. And on the wall behind him, barely visible, marks, scratches or writing. He made the print, then a second print with increased exposure to bring out the wall's detail. Numbers. Definitely numbers, scratched into the wood in rough strokes. His hands shook slightly as he examined the image. This was not accident, not coincidence. This was communication. Someone was using his photographs to send messages. Someone who understood that these images would be developed privately, studied carefully, archived officially. Someone who could not or would not approach the police directly, but needed certain information documented. The question was, what were they trying to say? And why choose photographs, the most permanent, most scrutinized form of evidence, as their medium? Murphy would need to see this, would need to understand that something larger was happening in these images. But explaining would require admitting that he had been noticing patterns, collecting evidence, thinking about these cases outside his official role as mere documentarian. He looked again at the numbers on the wall. They meant something. A date, coordinates, code. Without context, they were just scratches. But someone had ensured they would be photographed, preserved, available for interpretation. The dark room felt smaller suddenly, the red light more oppressive. He had spent years making himself invisible, avoiding attention, staying safely within his narrow professional boundaries. These photographs were pushing him beyond those boundaries, demanding engagement he had carefully avoided. Outside, fog pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the city, the blurred figure moved through streets, timing appearances with mechanical precision, leaving traces only cameras could capture. And he stood in his dark room, staring at evidence of something he did not yet understand, but could no longer ignore. The images demanded witness, and he had always been, above all else, a witness. Murphy listened to his explanation with the expression of a man trying to decide whether his photographer had gone mad or was onto something genuinely disturbing. The prints lay spread across the detective's desk. 6 images spanning nearly a year, each containing a blurred figure that should not have been there. "You are suggesting someone is deliberately appearing in your photographs," Murphy said carefully. "Someone with enough knowledge to time their presence during your exposures." He nodded, feeling foolish even as he maintained certainty. Murphy tapped one of the prints. "And these numbers?" "I do not know, but they were placed where the camera would capture them." The detective was quiet for a long time, studying the images with the methodical attention that made him better than most of his colleagues. Finally, he gathered the prints, placed them in a folder, and locked them in his desk drawer. "I will make inquiries, discreetly. In the meantime, continue documenting as usual. If this figure appears again, note everything: time, light conditions, exact positioning. Treat it like evidence, because that is what it might be." Relief mixed with new anxiety. Murphy believed him, or at least was willing to investigate, but investigation meant visibility, questions, attention. The comfortable anonymity he had cultivated was beginning to crack. The numbers haunted him. He copied them into his own notebook, studied them from different angles. Dates seemed most likely, month and year, perhaps. But dates of what? Future crimes? Past events? Without context, numbers were just marks. Dr. Winters appeared at his studio 3 days later, unannounced, carrying a leather case that suggested professional purpose. She accepted his offer of tea, sat in the single chair not occupied by equipment, and came directly to her point. Detective Murphy mentioned your observations about recurring figures in crime scene photographs. He hesitated, uncertain how much Murphy had shared.
He showed me the images, she continued. I found them intriguing. Not from a supernatural perspective, I have no patience for spiritualist nonsense, but from a practical one. Someone is clearly attempting communication through an unusual medium. Her directness was startling, but welcome. You believe it is deliberate? Obviously. The positioning is too precise for accident. She opened her case, withdrew a notebook. I have been reviewing the murders you photographed. 6 cases over 14 months. All remain unsolved. All victims were either Chinese or Irish. All worked in manual labor. And all had some historical connection to railroad construction. The final detail stopped him. Railroad construction? Yes. I requested employment records from the transcontinental railroad companies. 4 of the victims worked on the line in the 1860s. The other 2 were family members of men who worked there. The connection is not obvious without investigation, which is perhaps why no one noticed. He thought about the thousands who had worked on the railroad. Chinese laborers brought in by the thousands, Irish immigrants desperate for wages, dangerous work, brutal conditions. Many died. Many more simply disappeared from records, their fates unknown and uninvestigated. Why would that matter now? He asked. That is the question. Dr. Winters sipped her tea, grimacing slightly at its weakness. But it suggests a pattern. These are not random murders. Someone is killing people with railroad connections. And someone else, your blurred figure, is trying to ensure the pattern is noticed. The implications unfolded slowly. A conspiracy reaching back years. Victims selected for reasons related to decades-old labor. And a witness who could not or would not approach authorities directly, who instead used photographs as anonymous testimony. The numbers, he said suddenly. Could they be railroad coordinates? Milepost markers? Dr. Winters considered this. Possible. The format would be consistent. I can check against railroad maps. They worked through the afternoon, her medical knowledge and his photographic documentation creating an unexpected collaboration. She explained injury patterns. He pointed out details in images she had not previously examined. The murders shared similarities beyond victim selection. Professional execution, minimal evidence, systematic rather than passionate. Someone with training, Dr. Winters concluded. Possibly multiple people working in coordination. This is not the work of a lone disturbed individual. Mary's brother Patrick arrived that evening, while Dr. Winters was still there, his police uniform drawing immediate stiffness into the interaction. He looked between them with undisguised suspicion. Murphy said you had questions about old railroad records, Patrick said, addressing him while studiously ignoring Dr. Winters. Seems an odd interest for a photographer. He explained carefully, downplaying his involvement, emphasizing that he was simply following Murphy's instructions. Patrick listened with the expression of someone who had already decided his opinion. The railroad was years ago. Hundreds died building that line. Tragic, yes, but accidents happen in dangerous work. Connecting it to current crimes seems, he searched for a diplomatic word, speculative. Dr. Winters stood, gathering her materials with deliberate precision. Speculation, based on documented evidence, is called investigation, officer. But I can see we are keeping you from more important duties. Patrick flushed, but said nothing as she departed. After she left, he turned to face the photographer directly. Mary is worried about you. Says you are getting involved in things that could be dangerous. She asked me to warn you. The concern was genuine beneath the professional distance. He appreciated it, even as he recognized its limits. Patrick saw the world in clear categories: law and disorder, citizen and criminal, safe and dangerous. The blurred figures in photographs did not fit these categories, and Patrick had no framework for understanding them. I am only doing the work Murphy requests, he said quietly. Murphy is a good detective, but he chases theories too far sometimes, gets obsessed. You do not have that luxury. You are... Patrick stopped himself, but the unspoken words hung between them. You are Chinese. You are vulnerable. You can be made to disappear if you inconvenience the wrong people. After Patrick left, he sat in the darkening studio thinking about vulnerability. The blurred figure understood vulnerability, understood that direct testimony was impossible, that official channels were closed, that only indirect methods, cryptic messages in photographs, offered any safety. The studio was vandalized 2 nights later. Nothing stolen, but chemicals spilled, plates smashed, his best camera damaged. No witnesses, no evidence. The message was clear enough. Stop asking questions. Murphy came personally to examine the damage, his expression grim. This is connected. Someone knows you are investigating. I am not investigating. I am only photographing what you asked me to photograph. The distinction may not matter to them. Murphy helped him right an overturned table. I can assign an officer to watch the building. That would make me more visible, not less. Murphy nodded, understanding the logic. Protection drew attention, and attention increased danger. The photographer's safety had always depended on being beneath notice. That invisibility was now compromised. Dr. Winters provided practical help, a loan to replace damaged equipment, connections to a glass supplier who offered fair prices. She mentioned nothing about stopping the investigation, seemed to assume he would continue. Her confidence was oddly bolstering. He repaired what could be repaired, replaced what could not. The work took weeks and depleted his savings. Business decreased as word spread about the vandalism, customers assuming he was involved in something disreputable. The careful reputation he had built was eroding, but the blurred figure appeared again. Another murder, another crime scene, another photograph containing a shadow that should not exist. This time, the figure stood near a doorway, and the wall beside it held scratched marks, not numbers, but letters. 2 initials, large enough to read in the print. He showed Murphy and Dr. Winters together. The 3 of them crowded into his studio after dark, speaking quietly as if the walls might report their conversation. The initials matched a name from Dr. Winters's research, a labor contractor from the railroad years. a man who had supervised Chinese work crews and was known for particular brutality. "He is still alive," Dr. Winters confirmed. "Wealthy now, owns property throughout the city, politically connected." Murphy stared at the photograph. "This is accusation. Your figure is naming suspects, or providing context," Dr. Winters suggested, "showing why these victims were selected. They knew something about this man, perhaps. Witnessed something during the railroad construction that made them dangerous years later." The theory had weight. The Transcontinental Railroad's completion had been celebrated as great achievement, but the cost in lives, especially Chinese lives, had been deliberately uncounted. If someone was eliminating witnesses to crimes from that era, it suggested those crimes were significant enough to justify murder years later. "We need more evidence," Murphy said. "Real evidence, not photographs of blurred figures and scratched messages. Something that would survive court scrutiny." But obtaining that evidence meant making inquiries that would alert the very people they suspected. The investigation had reached an impasse. Too much pattern to ignore, too little proof to act upon. He lay awake that night listening to the city's sounds through his window. Somewhere in these streets, the blurred figure moved through fog and shadow, timing appearances with mechanical precision, leaving cryptic testimony in photographic margins. Someone who understood his vulnerability because they shared it. Someone who had found the only safe method of witness, indirect, anonymous, permanent. The photographs accumulated in his files like evidence in a trial that might never occur. Each image a fragment of truth, too small to convince alone, but collectively building towards something undeniable. He was becoming keeper of these fragments, custodian of testimony no court would accept, but history might require. Morning came with its usual demands. Clients needed portraits, bills required payment. Life continued its ordinary rhythms even as extraordinary patterns emerged beneath the surface. He prepared his chemicals, cleaned his lenses, tried to find normalcy in routine. But the blurred figure had made normalcy impossible, had drawn him into something larger than his comfortable, careful existence, and retreat was no longer available as option. Because some things, once witnessed, demanded response. The glass plates began to feel heavier with each new commission, as if light itself carried the weight of what they revealed. He had documented hundreds of deaths, each held within its silver-gray confines. Yet recently, every image seemed to pull him closer to something hidden beneath the surface. The blurred figure had not reappeared in nearly a month, but he had come to expect it, waiting for shapes to form where none should be, scanning each exposure for the familiar outline. By day, he maintained the rituals of work, portraits, small advertising contracts, and the occasional police assignment. By night, he experimented. A corner of his studio became devoted to quantifying exposure times, to testing duplicate plates under variations in temperature and chemistry, to isolating every possible cause for the recurring spectral presence. The conclusion troubled him. There was no chemical anomaly. The figure would not be explained away by the limits of science, which meant that either someone continued to manipulate his scenes, or something far subtler was at play, intent rather than chance. Dr. Winters visited often, under pretense of needing reference images for her medical work. Their collaboration had grown. She shared with him records from the coroner's office, comparing crime scene details with his plates. Her handwriting filled notebooks in neat, measured lines. Time of death, wound description, signs of struggle, environmental conditions. The patterns she mapped frightened them both. The killings had progressed westward across the city, as if following a deliberate route.
"What worries me," she said one evening as he poured fixative over a fresh print, "is not how many there are, but how easily they disappear from the record. The papers barely mention them now. The police reports close prematurely. Someone powerful demands silence." She nodded slowly. "Yes. And someone else, your blurred witness, refuses that silence. But I fear they are running out of time." He wanted to ask who she meant by they, but knew she did not know either. Murphy's visits grew rare. When they did meet, it was in public spaces, a diner, a street corner, places offering the illusion of casual conversation. His superior officers had begun questioning his priorities, hinting that certain investigations should be deferred for political reasons. Murphy never said the words directly, but the tension in his jaw revealed what he withheld. "Keep your negatives hidden," the detective advised one cold morning, "preferably outside this building." "People have been asking about you. I have copies in a secure place," he said, though that was only half true. "Good. Whoever your ghost is, they're leading us into someone's secrets, and people who keep secrets in this city don't forgive trespass." After Murphy left, he walked through Chinatown, the familiar streets now uneasy. He noticed eyes following him, conversations halting at his passing. He had done nothing wrong, but had become a name whispered in places where silence used to guard safety. His reputation as photographer had changed, no longer the invisible craftsman, but the man who photographed the wrong things. Returning to the studio at dusk, he found a letter slid under his door. 2 photographs enclosed, contact prints of his own plates, copies made from negatives only he possessed. Someone had entered his storage, handled his archives. Across each print ran an inked line in neat calligraphy: "Truth burns clean." The message, more warning than threat, unsettled him more than outright violence would have. Whoever had written it understood the language of photographs, the meaning of possession. A photograph was never neutral. It declared what one chose to reveal and what one chose to hide. He took to sleeping in the studio, revolver near hand, though he could not have fired it with confidence. The street outside echoed through fog like a hollow drum. Nights became sequences of light and shadow, the glow of coal lamps, the metallic sheen of chemical trays. In those hours, he decided to test something entirely new. If the figure's appearances aligned with certain scenes, perhaps he could anticipate one. The killings followed pattern. The photographs followed the killings. He pored over Dr. Winters's list of unsolved cases, drew lines between addresses, marked the order of occurrence. The route formed a slow arc toward the city's south end. A warehouse district near the railroad yards lay directly along this arc. It was a place he disliked photographing: dark, windswept, too many rats, but intuition urged him there. He scouted the site by daylight, noting entry points and vantage positions. That night, a human shape moved briefly in the lantern glow between buildings. He triggered his exposure by instinct. When the plate developed, the frame revealed nothing but murky shadows. But the next morning, news spread. A worker found dead not 50 yards from where he had aimed his camera. Murphy appeared within the hour, bringing the grim confirmation. "You were right. He was killed not long after you left." That means the killer was already there, or watching you leave. The photograph, under stronger light, displayed faint vertical lines on a wall near where the man had fallen.
At first they seemed random, but under magnification they resolved into letters C, L, W. Dr. Winters confirmed his thought.
The initials matched a name she had uncovered earlier, Chen Li Wei, a laborer recorded in railroad archives as missing during the Sierra blasting operations nearly 2 decades prior. A note in the margin listed him among those presumed dead after a tunnel collapse, but she could find no death certificate, nothing after that entry at all. "Perhaps your blurred figure is no ghost," she suggested quietly. "Perhaps he's one of the missing." If that were true, it explained everything and nothing. How could a man who vanished years ago reappear now at every new murder? Unless he had survived, changed, learned to move unseen among the living. They began tracing Li Wei's trail together, traveling to outlying areas once used as camps for railroad crews. Most were ruins now, weathered wooden cabins half buried in weeds, stone fire pits filled with ash. He photographed them all, partly as documentation, partly in the strange hope of capturing another trace. The silence of those places pressed against him. It was hard to believe anyone had ever laughed, or eaten, or dreamed there. One night, while developing a plate from an abandoned camp's barrow mound, he saw it. Far in the frame's edge, almost indistinguishable from shadow, stood the familiar outline. Worn coat, cap, posture slightly stooped as if weary beyond exhaustion. This time the figure's face was faintly visible, motionless enough for some clarity. The eyes looked directly into the camera. His heart beat hard enough to shake the tray. The ghost, the witness, whatever he was, knew exactly where to stand, how to be found. He printed the image, dried it, carried it to Dr. Winters in the morning light. She studied it with professional composure that faltered only after a long silence. "This man," she said softly, touching the faint face with her finger. "He bears the same scars described in the camp records. The survivors of the tunnel explosion mentioned a Chen worker burned across one side. Look close, here near the temple. The mark was there, even through blur. The realization settled on them like dust from a distant explosion. Someone had lived through a massacre, had remained hidden all these years, emerging now to reveal the truth through the only means available, photographic presence. Murphy's official channels yielded confirmation. The company overseeing construction of the Sierra tunnels had falsified logs listing dozens killed to conceal fatal labor conditions. Li Wei's name appeared among supposed victims, his crew's wages signed off by a contractor who later became one of San Francisco's wealthiest businessmen, the same one whose initials had appeared in an earlier plate. The pieces fitted together with terrible simplicity. Those who had witnessed the fraud and the killings beneath the mountains were being eliminated, 2 decades later, as silence insurance. Li Wei, invisible to police and public alike, had chosen to haunt photographs rather than newspapers, using the medium of evidence itself to force recognition. He wanted to believe this was the end of the mystery, but endings rarely announced themselves so cleanly. The danger, once distant, had now turned sharply toward them. 2 nights later, someone followed him home from a commission. The footsteps steady, only stopping when he passed into a street with visible lamplight. He began varying his route, hiding negatives in different locations, memorizing which he could not afford to lose. Dr. Winters insisted on continuing despite risks. When he asked why, she said simply, "We record what others wish forgotten."
That is reason enough. Murphy arranged a discreet meeting with a reformist journalist, a man known for exposing municipal corruption. The detective believed the photographs might finally find their public audience. Yet the thought filled him with dread. Once printed, truth left no room for retreat. What had begun as a craft, a way to make a living quietly, had become testimony against powerful men. The night before the meeting, he opened his archives one last time and looked through the sequence chronologically. The first faint blur in an alley, the worker's cap, the scratched numbers, the initials, the face emerging from shadow. A message written across years, plate by plate. The medium of light revealing human persistence, not haunting, not ghostly vengeance, but endurance refusing to fade. Outside the studio, rain came down steady on the rooftops. Chemicals mixed softly in their trays, releasing the metallic scent of silver in transition. He thought of Li Wei somewhere in the labyrinth of warehouses, watching, waiting. Perhaps they served the same purpose now, each preserving fragments of truth at great personal cost. Perhaps history, to remember it all, required such witnesses. He extinguished the lamps, closed the door, and stepped into the wet street. The city lay encoded before him in shades of gray, as if every wall concealed something half-seen, ready to surface with the proper exposure of light. Morning crept into the city like a thief, thin light, slipping between shutters, footsteps quiet on wet cobblestones. He had not slept. The night before, he hid every essential negative beneath the floorboards and sealed them in wax paper envelopes. Any noise outside made him reach for the small revolver by the table, though he doubted he could hold it steady. Murphy arrived soon after dawn, face drawn from sleeplessness. He placed a folded newspaper on the desk. The headline described the death of a dock foreman, no foul play suspected, accidental fall. But both men knew that the pattern fit too perfectly to be accident. The foreman had worked the Sierra line with Chen Li Wei.
"They're cutting the witnesses faster now," Murphy said. "We're near the end, one way or another." They planned fragile actions that morning, the sort that left no trace on paper. Coded messages to a journalist, quiet inquiries into property ledgers, letters that might or might not survive the post office's sorting room. Dr. Winters would continue gathering coroner records, cloaked as research. Each worked separately, threads converging only in knowledge, never in visible alliance. Yet he could feel the walls closing around him. Clients thinned, mail went missing. Familiar faces in Chinatown began avoiding his doorway. Protected by no faction, belonging nowhere, he stood exposed between power and secrecy. That night, while developing an ordinary portrait plate, he noticed fog curling through the window seams, though he had sealed them earlier. The air grew colder. He turned, and in the half-dark behind him stood the man seen in every blurred exposure. Same bent posture, same cap, the faint trace of scars catching light along one cheek. Li Wei. Not ghost, not apparition. Flesh, breathing, though his eyes carried the distant shine of someone long unused to daylight. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence felt older than words. Then the man pointed toward the stack of negatives and said, barely audible, "You see what they did?" "I see what you showed me," he answered. His own voice surprised him with its calmness. "But I do not yet know it all." Li Wei stepped closer, movements light, almost cautious. The smell of soot and damp clung to him. They buried the men in the tunnel, dozens, claimed collapse. No bodies returned. We dug them out ourselves that night before the officers came. He stopped, breath uneven. When I went to speak, they fired at me. I ran, hid under the river bridge for days. They said I was dead. So I became dead. The photographer let him speak in fragments, each pause filling the room like exhaled smoke. A story pieced together through repetition. A crew detonating charges too early. Foremen forcing laborers back into unstable passages. The mountain burying man and evidence alike. Wages stolen. Survivors silenced. Names struck from ledgers. He understood now the killings of recent months. Each victim had helped conceal the massacre, rewarded, then erased. Li Wei reached into his coat, withdrawing a small stack of torn photographs. Early collodion prints, faded to ghost gray. Each depicted faces of Chinese laborers before the tunnel work, men smiling shyly, holding lanterns, proud of being recorded. "These are the ones gone," Li Wei whispered. "This is all we had left of them." The hands that held the photographs trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. Years of hiding had eroded flesh into shadow. "You used my camera because your own words could not be spoken," the photographer said quietly. "You have eyes no one accuses. They see your work, not the man behind it." "I need such eyes." They talked until first light. Li Wei refused to sit, as if any rest would permit capture. Before leaving through the alley's mist, he pressed a roll of film wrapped in oilcloth into the photographer's hands. "The mountain still keeps proof," he said. "They hid it in the tunnels under the yard near the bay. You will see." When he was gone, the studio felt colder, but the coil of fear that had grown for months straightened into clarity. This was not superstition, it was record-keeping, the dead demanding balance through the living. Within days, Murphy secured discreet travel passes under the pretext of documenting railway extensions. Dr. Winters insisted on joining. Her skills might be needed if they found physical remains. They left the city quietly, carrying only one camera, a box of plates, and the oilcloth roll. The journey south along the cliffs was long and dull. Rain turned tracks into mud, and nights spent in tavern rooms reeked of lamp oil and cheap tobacco. They spoke little, a rhythm of endurance born from fear of being overheard. The bay yard Li Wei had described sat within property owned by the same contractor whose initials marked earlier photographs. The gates were chained, the buildings abandoned except for a single watchman asleep in a chair. Beyond the yard stretched a slope of earth pierced by dark mouths of old cargo tunnels. Murphy whispered, "This is where they moved freight before the new depot. Perfect place to hide anything." They entered one tunnel, lantern light flickering over damp timbers. Water dripped rhythmlessly from the ceiling. A few rods in, Murphy crouched. The floor had collapsed into a pit where boards had rotted through. At the bottom lay shapes half buried in silt. Dr. Winters caught her breath. The lantern illuminated fragments of human remains, boots, a tool belt still fastened, traces of cloth. "This is them," she said softly. "The ones who never came home." He steadied his camera, though his hands shook uncontrollably. The act of photographing felt sacramental. Each plate captured not only bones, but silence returning as evidence. They worked quickly, knowing discovery would end them. The lantern dimmed,
Murphy climbed back to the pit's edge to check the entrance. When he returned, his expression was raw. "We're not alone," he said. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel mouth. 3 men silhouetted against the faint daylight, carrying weapons. Voices heavy with authority ordered them to step forward. He recognized one, an officer often seen at city tribunals, known associate of the contractor. Murphy's revolver flashed once, echoing through the tunnel. The lantern burst, smoke, shouts, confusion followed. He dragged the camera case toward the narrow side opening Li Wei had mentioned in his notes. Dr. Winters crawled beside him, clutching the exposed plates to her chest.
They emerged through a fissure leading to the cliffs. Below them, the ocean heaved against broken rocks. Behind, the tunnel mouth burned red with lantern fire. Murphy stumbled out moments later, blood dark on his sleeve. "Go," he said. "You have the proof. Go before they catch it." He obeyed, half carrying Dr. Winters down the rocky path until the shouts faded in wind's thunder. Hidden amid the cliffs, they watched daylight break across the sea. 3 plates survived intact. One displayed the pit of remains. The second showed identifying artifacts marked with railroad insignia. The third, taken moments before the attack, captured the tunnel mouth with a faint shape standing in the shadows behind the intruders. A tall figure, still and calm amid chaos. Li Wei had been there, unseen until the light revealed him once more. They returned to San Francisco under false names, carrying the glass plates wrapped in clothes. Murphy vanished, whether arrested or hiding, they never learned. Newspaper offices ignored anonymous deliveries of evidence, returning prints with polite refusals. The city was not ready to see itself clearly. But the photographer's studio reopened quietly. From the outside, it looked unchanged, sign repainted, images displayed in the window. Yet inside, every drawer hid copies of those plates. Dr. Winters helped him catalog them under pseudonyms. Together, they prepared duplicates on thin paper negatives that could be smuggled more easily. Late one evening, while they printed by lamp glow, a single knock sounded on the door. When opened, no one stood there, only an envelope resting on the step. Inside, a short note, cut from newspaper print. "The light reaches farther than they think." Beneath it, folded neatly, a small scrap of paper bearing coordinates that matched one of the tunnels they had photographed. He looked down the street, empty but for rolling fog. Somewhere in that monotone veil, Li Wei moved again, free and invisible. The killings ceased after that night. The silence felt like both mercy and warning. Each photograph he touched afterward carried double exposure, the visible image and the unseen cost behind it. He no longer believed in ghosts, yet he knew the dead watched closely whenever truth was fixed in silver and glass. He continued his work cautiously, assisting those few willing to testify, always aware that light, once captured, could wound as much as it could reveal. And somewhere beyond the reach of police files or superstition, the man who had lived too long in darkness guarded the same proof in his own secret places. A shadow, keeping history alive through absence. For months, the plates lay hidden beneath the false floorboards of the studio. Each time footsteps sounded outside, he imagined them being found, seized, destroyed, erased from the record. Yet the threat never came. The silence that followed the tunnel discovery was heavier than noise, as if the city itself had agreed never to speak of what had been unearthed. Dr. Winters visited often, not as openly as before. She wore darker clothing now and kept her hair tucked beneath a hat, her posture cautious on the stairwell. She never lingered near the window. "They have moved on to other stories," she told him once. "But forgetfulness is not forgiveness. They will strike again if provoked." He nodded, returning to his workbench. The air always smelled faintly of ether and smoke. Some days when the wind blew from the bay, he thought he could still taste the dust from that collapsed tunnel. Murphy's absence was a shadow stretching across everything. No word, no rumor, not even a report of dismissal. Officially, he had never existed in that last investigation. The detectives' files were locked away, transferred to other departments. Yet one morning, months later, an unmarked envelope arrived beneath the studio door, containing a small brass police badge. Its edges were scorched. No message accompanied it, but the meaning was clear enough. Silence bought with sacrifice. Work continued, quieter than before. He photographed births, weddings, storefront openings, safe subjects that drew no attention. Clients complimented his steadiness, saying he seemed calmer now, mature. None could guess how much of that calm came from deliberately holding still in order not to be noticed. Only Dr. Winters remained close, and their bond deepened through shared secrets. They dined together in the evenings, speaking in the careful rhythm of those who measure every word. She had begun writing about ethics in scientific documentation, her way of embedding their story in abstract form. "Truth survives best when disguised as theory," she said with a small smile, though her eyes carried fatigue that did not fade. Then, one cold morning, a boy from a small reform newspaper appeared at the door, asking for confirmation of a rumor that the photographer possessed images proving corruption in the railroad's labor camp contracts. He denied it, of course, and the boy left satisfied. But something in the encounter reopened a door he had been straining to keep shut. If one curious apprentice could find him, others could too, especially those for whom truth was profitable only in silence. That night, he decided to act. He sorted every surviving negative, selecting those that told the story most clearly: the buried workers, the company insignia, the faces of the murdered witnesses. He no longer thought of them as photographs. They were testimony written in light. Dr. Winters and he composed a letter to the editor of the same reform paper. They did not sign names, only the initials of their lost allies, M.W. for Murphy, C.L. for Lee Way. Attached were copy negatives on lightweight paper, small enough to conceal between envelopes. If published, the images would speak for themselves. He carried the parcel across the city under steady drizzle, every step weighted by consequence. At the newspaper office, he left the envelope with the night clerk and returned to the street without looking back. Only then did he realize that despite the fear, his hands had stopped shaking. Days passed with no response. The papers printed nothing, and rumors fell silent. He concluded the editors had destroyed the contents, unwilling to challenge the railroad magnates whose advertising paid for ink and paper. Then, a week later, freshly printed broadsheets appeared across the marketplaces. The lead image showed the tunnel pit. Beneath it, bold type spelled out a headline that stung his blood cold. "Graves beneath the Western Line. Evidence of old crimes unearthed." No source credited, no names mentioned. Only grainy reproductions of their photographs and a cautious editorial citing newly recovered documentation. He stood at a booth reading the article while vendors shouted around him. For a moment, the city seemed to tilt. Relief, grief, and terror blended until he could not tell one from another. By evening, crowds gathered before City Hall. Bureau clerks, laborers, and union men demanded inquiry. The government promised investigation within days, yet amidst the clamor, he noticed policemen circulating with questions about who had provided the photographs. Rumor already trailed him like the smell of his chemicals. He expected retribution, but none came at first. Instead, there was jagged triumph. Papers sold out. Speeches were made about justice long delayed. For a week, hope bloomed strange and fragile in that fog-bound city. Then, on a night heavy with mist, the studio caught fire. The blaze began in the alley, too precise to be accident. Flames cut up the outer wall before neighbors could wake him. He ran downstairs barefoot, choking on smoke, dragging what plates he could reach. By the time the fire wagons arrived, almost everything was gone. He stood in the street, wrapped in a wet blanket, watching 30 years of images crumple into cinders. Dr. Winters appeared through the crowd, her face sooty, eyes wide. She had saved her own set of copies, hidden at the university laboratory. The evidence survived, but the man's craft, his livelihood, had vanished. In the morning's pale ash, investigators recorded the destruction as accidental electrical fault. He and Dr. Winters said nothing. What mattered had already escaped through print and rumor. The photographs could be denied, but not unseen. Days later, they learned that several railroad officials, including the powerful contractor whose initials had stained their first plate, had fled the city. One was later found across the bay, dead by apparent suicide. Another disappeared altogether. A trial convened against minor supervisors within weeks. It was not justice, not truly, but it was noise enough to drown years of silence. Among those summoned to testify was a man calling himself Lee. When the photographer heard the name, his pulse jolted. The witness arrived, veiled and quiet, refusing to speak publicly, but offering sworn statements in private session. No one outside the grand jury ever heard his words, but their effect rippled outward. The verdicts announced soon after were guilty enough to shock the city. The witness vanished once more. Some said he returned east. Others whispered the sea took him. The photographer preferred a simpler thought, that Li Wei had resumed moving unseen through the streets, guiding memory where law had failed. When calm returned, he rented a small ground-floor room on Jackson Street. The new studio had plain walls and second-hand furniture, but the window light fell better. He began again, portraits mostly, family photographs, children reluctant to sit still. Dr. Winters joined him often, her medical work blending now with photography in experiments on accurate documentation. Clients found her presence strange for a woman, but quickly trusted her steadiness. One afternoon, while sorting through salvaged glass fragments, he found something unexpected, a negative charred at the edges but still intact in its center. When held to the light, it revealed the tunnel from that terrible day, but in the background, faint and almost imperceptible, Li Wei's figure stood between the beams of collapsing boards as if preserved in the act of watching. A final witness watching himself being seen. He made one print from it, small and deliberately faded. When it dried, he framed it without inscription and placed it on the shelf above the sink. It became a kind of compass. Each time he looked at it, he remembered that truth survived through endurance, not victory. Weeks later, word came that Murphy's body had been found upriver, beyond the city limits. Dr. Winters read the report aloud in her flat voice, then folded the paper neatly away. "He kept us alive long enough to finish," she said. He nodded, though it felt like temporary comfort offered to the living in absence of certainty. That winter, the government erected a wooden plaque over the Bay Yard, marking it as historic site of railroad labor contribution. The inscription never mentioned the dead, the murders, or the trial. It celebrated innovation and perseverance. Still, people brought flowers. He visited once, gently pressing his hand against the wood. As the tide murmured below, he imagined all the forgotten faces gathered there, the workers once erased, the witness turned phantom, the detective erased by his own persistence. Above them all hung the steady, quiet light that he had spent his life learning to hold. When he returned home that night, the studio was dark except for the reflection off chemical trays. The print of Li Wei seemed almost to breathe. He turned off the lamp, letting the faint moonlight reveal the outlines. For the first time since the beginning, he felt the burden ease, as though the story no longer belonged solely to him. Truth, once revealed to light, kept developing on its own, slow, patient, unstoppable, long after the photographer stepped away from the frame. The years softened the city but never stilled it. San Francisco grew outward from its own ruins, layering streets upon forgotten cellars, shops upon ash. The earthquakes came and went. Fires followed them like old companions. Each time, some part of the city changed shape, yet beneath the new facades lingered the same impatience for forgetting. He did not fight it anymore. Forgetting had its purpose. It kept people alive. His studio on Jackson Street endured, smaller now, with faded curtains and the faint odor of developer that never truly left the walls. The sign above the door weathered to pale gray, the lettering ghosted, as if some past message insisted on remaining visible. Clients knew him as a careful craftsman, solemn, discreet, never prying. Families came for portraits, sailors for keepsakes, mothers for images of sleeping infants to send across the ocean. The camera, reliable as breath, stood at the center of it all. Each morning he carried it to the window bench, polished the lens, tested the light on his palm. The ritual steadied him better than prayer ever could. Dr. Winters visited most weeks, her hair silvering now, her face sharpened by time into dignity rather than austerity. She had taken to writing for medical journals, campaigning quietly for reforms in sanitation and housing. They shared long afternoons of work in companionable silence, she annotating notes while he adjusted exposures. Some evenings they dined in the narrow courtyard, the sound of rain on tin roofs their only conversation. Neither mentioned the past unless some fragments surfaced naturally. Once she found an old envelope among his negatives and asked, not unkindly, "Do you ever consider publishing your account?" He smiled faintly. "The truth speaks well enough without my name beside it." Still, there were reminders. Clippings left on his doorstep without signatures, anonymous letters of gratitude in careful Chinese script, A photograph returned from the other side of the country, the image of Li Wei, supposedly. It showed only a laborer's figure, blurred, but the handwriting on the back read, "Still working in the light you caught." At first he thought it a hoax, but when he compared the stance to the old negatives, the resemblance stunned him. The same narrow shoulders, the same way of standing between motion and stillness, half turned toward the lens. He kept the photograph in a box behind the counter.
It served as a reminder that survival was its own kind of justice. One quiet spring morning, a young boy appeared at the studio door, clutching a newspaper article about the railroad memorial's unveiling. "They're asking for a dedication photograph," the boy said. "They said you were the man who could make the picture look like history." He nearly refused. Public ceremonies meant crowds, officials, speeches, everything he had spent years avoiding. Yet something in the boy's frankness stopped him. The city had changed. Perhaps it was time his silence loosened a little. So he went. The memorial was modest, a granite plinth at the old bay yard where the tunnels once opened, surrounded by trimmed grass and iron fencing. Officials spoke about progress and triumph, not the buried or the betrayed. The air tasted of sea salt and politics. Yet between the speeches he saw faces in the crowd, older laborers, wives of men long gone, watching with quiet accusation. They were the true witnesses. He set up his camera near the edge, away from the press. Through the lens, the scene composed itself. Polished boots on the platform, ribbons trimmed in gold, flags rippling. When the shutter clicked, he felt again that old sensation. The mechanical certainty that light could not lie, even when words did. Later, developing the plate, he noticed an unfamiliar silhouette in the background, a shape slightly out of focus, standing beside the memorial's base. A man with shoulders stooped, hands clasped behind him, facing the ocean. For an instant, the room felt very still. He enlarged the section carefully. The image was too blurred for features, yet unmistakable. Li Wei, or the memory of him. There was no fear in seeing it, only understanding. Some presences never leave. They simply change their form of appearing. Dr. Winters saw the print that evening. She studied it wordlessly, tracing the outline with a forefinger. "Perhaps he wanted to see the monument," she said. He nodded, though they both knew the monument was not where the truth resided. They made several copies of the image, sending one anonymously to the city archives. Another he placed on the studio wall beside portraits of ordinary families, people whose names meant nothing to history books, but everything to themselves. The ghostly figure among them looked strangely at ease, as if belonging, finally, to the living again. The years that followed carried quiet comforts. Apprentices came and went. He trained those who wanted to learn, insisting first on patience before technique. "A photograph never lies," he told them, "but it only tells what you have the courage to see." Few understood what he meant, but the lesson persisted longer than his words. Evenings became gentler as his hands slowed. He learned to savor the time between exposures, the hum of rain pipes, the murmur of customers downstairs, the whispered hum of chemicals working their alchemy unseen. The city outside thundered with electricity and cable cars, yet inside he kept his measured pace, content with the familiar rhythm of images forming in silver and shadow. One winter afternoon, while tidying drawers, he came upon the charred negative recovered years before. The tiny image still glimmered beneath its scarred surface. For the first time, he placed it in sunlight rather than lamplight. It brightened faintly, revealing greater detail. The scarred hillside, the shape of a figure lifting a lantern inside the tunnel mouth. The flame looked almost real, still burning after all this time. He took a fresh glass plate and made a print from it, not to sell, not to show, but to remind himself of what endurance could look like through glass. On the back, he wrote a single line: "For those who built and still wait to be seen." He placed it inside a cedar box the width of his palm and hid it behind the bookshelf. That evening, as the sun set crimson over the harbor, he climbed the steps to the roof. Fog rolled in from the west, softening the skyline into half-light. The city hummed below him, every chimney, every voice part of a great breathing body. He looked toward the bay, where ships glimmered in fading color, and for a fleeting second believed he could see figures walking across the low tide, shadows returning home. He descended before dark, lit the single oil lamp, and sat by the camera. The flame wavered in the brass lens, splitting into twin reflections, light and shadow, facing each other endlessly. He reached for a blank plate, unsure what he meant to capture, only knowing that habit demanded he try. When the shutter closed with its clean metallic click, it sounded oddly like a heartbeat. He smiled at that, and let the developing bath begin its quiet work. The image would take minutes to appear, perhaps longer, but he was in no hurry. Some truths required time to breathe. On the wall nearby hung the last photograph of the memorial, the one with Li Wei's indistinct form standing between stone and sea. The light from the lamp touched it faintly, so that the sea behind him seemed to shimmer again. Outside, the city drifted toward night, its fog swallowing details one by one until only the glow of lamps remained. Inside, the photographer waited, surrounded by the soft, chemical scent of permanence. When the plate began to yield its faint shapes, he leaned closer, not to interpret, but simply to witness. The light, long ago captured, was still speaking, and in that patient whisper, he found the peace that work itself had always promised, the quiet certainty that every shadow, given enough care, would learn how to turn back toward the light.